Good morning, everyone. Welcome everybody who's here in person. Welcome everybody who's here virtually. I'm Michael Benarroch, President and Vice-Chancellor at the University of Manitoba, and I'm happy that you're joining us today at this, our third annual Budget Town Hall. Some point we'll stop putting the number in front of there. But it is important that we come together to exchange ideas and connect and really consider the work that we're doing. Just our land acknowledgement. These are the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, the Inuit, the Unshinawik, the Dakota Oyate, and the national homeland of the Red River Métis. As president, I read this to affirm our university's commitment to move forward in partnership with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities in the spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. And I'm proud that our budget invests in these commitments. At a personal level, it does ground me in thinking about the work that we're doing in the location that we are in as an institution, and our commitments that we've made around truth and reconciliation. As in past years, I'm once again joined by the dynamic duo of Dr. Diane Hiebert-Murphy, our Provost and Vice-President academic, and our CFO and Controller, Mike Emslie. They're going to present today on the university's finances, a little bit about how they work, look back a little to last year, and a little bit forward in our budget. As you know, this is, as I said, our third annual town hall, and it's our priority to continue to hold these type of events, to engage in our community, to listen to you, and to take that information back. And if you look at how these have evolved, the presentations have evolved as we've continued to meet and talk. And I will say one other part of this is the Budget Advisory Committee, which gets together, and it has a representation of staff and faculty and students. You know, this presentation was made to them last week, and as usual, they've provided us feedback, and we incorporate that feedback to ensure that we're providing the information that our community wants to hear. I think at any time, budgets are of great importance. I mean, a lot of the funds are allocated in a particular way, but it's important to understand how we are able to move forward. Budget 2024 does this by supporting the commitments to our latest strategic plan, Momentum, Leading Change Together. And so we're continuing to invest in the priorities. There's a strategic planning committee, or an implementation committee, which has been looking at priorities and setting those, but the faculties and the units are already working on this. So today, we're going to have about a 45-minute presentation. We're going to let Diane and Mike go through the whole presentation first, complete it, hold your questions to the end, and then we'll have discussion at the end of the presentation, and that way we can have kind of the full picture of what we're doing. In case this goes longer, I have to leave at 11 o'clock to catch a flight, which has now been delayed twice already today, so hopefully it won't be delayed any longer. You know, if it goes past 11, don't feel like I don't care, and that's why I'm walking out. I do care, but I have a flight to catch. Also, if you're unable to ask a question this morning, you can email it to budgetconsultation@umanitoba.ca. You can also find today's slides, and we're going to record this session on the Town Hall website. That is at umanitoba.ca/town hall. So thank you for all coming today, and I'm going to turn it over to our Provost and CFO.
Well, thank you, Michael, and thank you all for coming out this morning. It's great to see this much interest in the university's financial situation. we weren't advancing Michael's slides for him, I'm sorry. So I'll start with an overview of some of the key concepts to understand about the university's financial information. And so this slide provides a summary of the university's revenues based on the financial results for March 31st, 2024. It includes revenues from both operating and non-operating activities. And when I say non-operating activities, those are the kind of light blue part, the smaller portion of the circle. And really what I'm talking about is revenues that come to the university with restrictions placed upon them. And this includes things like sponsored research, donations and special trust accounts, endowments, and capital funding. The outer ring of this pie, or this donut, I guess, shows the funding sources. So on the non-operating side, you can see it's broken out by provincial government funding, federal government funding, and other revenues, which include, as I mentioned, things like donations. And these funds are provided for specific purposes and need to be spent in accordance with the restrictions that have been placed upon them by the funders. The dark blue, or the larger section of this chart, is the revenue that supports operating activities. And operating activities are really those kind of core academic, operational, and ancillary costs that are incurred by the university. And they're funded by tuition, government grants, investment income, and income from our ancillary services. And this is the part of the budget that the university has control over. And it's really the focus of today's presentation, is that operating piece. So these two charts focus on that darker blue part of the slide before. And the left chart breaks out our operating revenue sources. And here you can see that our operating grant from the province is our largest funding source, making up about 55% of our operating revenue, about $400 million. This is an operating grant from the province. It's a block grant, meaning that it doesn't move up and down with enrollment or other drivers. It's determined by the province annually, and it's usually last year's grant plus or minus some percentage. In the last couple of years, they've also increased our operating grant to cover the cost of specific program expansions in health-related fields. The second largest source of operating revenues for the university comes from tuition, and that's about 30% of our operating revenue, or about $230 million. Domestic tuition in Manitoba is regulated by the province. So between tuition regulation and their decision on the operating grant, the province has a significant impact on about 85% of our operating revenue. So provincial policy decisions have a big impact on our ability to pay for things on campus. Legislation prevents the university from budgeting an operating deficit in any given year, so our budgeted expenses equal our budgeted revenues. And the pie chart on the right shows the breakdown of the university's operating expenses as of March 31st, 2024. And the majority of our expenses relate to people, with salaries and benefits making up about 75% of our operating expenses. The remaining 25% is non-salary expenses, things like the cost of maintaining our facilities, our IT systems, library materials, financial supports for students, and other supplies. More details are available in our annual financial report if you're interested. Key messages on this slide: tuition covers less than a third of our operating costs, and domestic tuition fees cover only a minority of the cost of delivering our programs. Government policy has a significant impact on the university's resources, and salaries are a significant component of the university's operating expenditures. So while we're discussing tuition, it's worth noting that U of M's tuition is very low relative to our peers. In 2000, the province froze tuition for about a decade and has regulated domestic tuition increases since. And this resulted in Manitoba having amongst the lowest tuition rates in the country. This information is from Stats Canada and gives you an idea of how tuition levels compare across provinces. And you can see Manitoba is about 25% below the national average. Although any increase can create challenges for some students, the revenue from tuition is an important part of how we pay to offer quality programs and services to our students. We are committed to reducing financial need as a barrier to students. and while rewarding outstanding academic performance when we can. So the Student Financial Aid and Award Office distributed over $36 million in student financial awards and support in the year ended March 31st, 24. And that's the equivalent of about 15% of our tuition revenue, and that doesn't include the amounts distributed to students by faculties and other units, which are also significant. The province does not regulate international tuition. International students pay tuition that is higher than domestic students and generally covers something closer to the full cost of the delivery of our programs. Until recently, international tuition increases at U of M were largely aligned with domestic increases. And like domestic tuition rate, Manitoba's international tuition is significantly lower than other provinces, currently at about half the national average. So I think Diane's up next.
Thanks, Mike. So University of Manitoba is required by law to present a balanced budget on operating activities, and that means that our planned expenditures can't exceed our expected revenues. I'm going to speak a little bit to how we go about allocating that operating budget. All right. So this is a diagram that illustrates how our budget model works. You can see that faculties and schools are at the center of the budget model. Most of the revenue flows to faculties and schools, and deans have input on how central services are resourced. So the model allocates tuition revenue and grant revenue to the academic units, and deans make decisions about how they're going to allocate that revenue within their faculties. From that revenue, faculties also fund the central units that support all of the faculties across campus. So that includes units like finance, human resources, IT, student affairs, research office, and physical plant. Every year, each faculty and central unit prepares a budget based on its needs and within its allocated resources. These individual budgets are then consolidated and presented to the Board of Governors for approval. So the cycle for the university's budget starts each spring. We say that it's always budget season at the university. It seems like we're always working on our budget. In the spring, we start by collecting data and preparing for the budget or the funding requests that we submit to government, and it ends the following spring with board approval. The timing of the budget process is dictated by our fiscal year, which ends March 31st, and by funding announcements that come from government. The timeline doesn't always nicely match up to our decision-making processes. So many of our processes around funding are collegial processes. The province usually informs us about our grant and tuition increases that are allowable very close to, or sometimes even after the start of the fiscal year. Once we have confirmation of our funding, we can actually start moving ahead on some of our plans. But that planning can sometimes take months or even longer, and it's that lag that can lead to surpluses in the budget. So let me give you an example. When you talk about academic hiring, we often will start those processes and make decisions about hiring faculty members and begin it early in the fall. So we post positions, we advertise, we're trying to get the best talent we can here to the University of Manitoba. We go through pretty extensive interview processes, and offers may go out early in the new year with start dates typically in the summer. So what happens is we may find out in February or March what our funding is going to be for the next year. We'll start that hiring process, but we won't necessarily have a person in place until the next July, which is a lag of about 17 months. It's not only hiring, it's other things also can take time to plan or to execute. So we sometimes have internally awarded funding for research or for other projects. We plan for renovation of spaces, for software upgrades and implementation. And all of these things require time to plan and to consult. Uncertainty over the resources make it difficult sometimes to move initiatives forward quickly and can lead to surpluses. That challenge is particularly significant when there's a big change between assumptions that we've used in the development of the budget and the funding and tuition increases that we actually have and find out about in the spring. Multi-year funding from the province would allow us to better manage our resources, and that's something that we are in discussion about with the province. Mike's going to come now and talk about where we landed in the 23-24 budget year.
Okay, so that concept that Diane just described is important as we discuss the results for the year ended March 31st, 2024. So we spoke at last year's town hall about the significant change between the funding assumptions we'd been using at the start of the budget process last year and then the actual funding announcement from the government in the spring of 2023. So prior to 23-24, the university's operating grant had been held flat or was reduced for a period of about 5 years. And when we started planning for the 23-24 fiscal year in the summer of 23, all indications were that any grant increase would be small. And as such, we communicated to units in the fall to plan for no increase to the grant and tuition increases of about 2.5–2.75%. This very limited revenue increase, combined with salary increases that had been negotiated in recently settled collective agreements, meant that most units were facing significant deficits as they started their planning cycle. And as such, deans and managers deferred hiring, delayed other projects in order to balance their budgets. When we received the funding letter in February, we were shocked and relieved to receive a 10.8% grant increase, which effectively replaced the cuts of the previous 5 years. While we'd been able to avoid most of the significant cuts, it took some time to kickstart the delayed investments. So for the year ended March 31st, 24, the university reported a $79.4 million consolidated surplus, and this slide shows how that surplus differed from the balanced budget. The top bar, the yellow bar on this chart, represents the portion of the surplus related to non-operating activities, which totaled $20.8 million. The non-operating surplus is really due to timing, as we talked about. These revenues are really limited in their use to the reason we received them. And so they'll be spent on research capital and supporting students in future years. The operating surplus was $59 million, and the rest of the bars kind of break down the source of that surplus. So you can see the largest bar, the blue bar, represents the surplus which resulted from faculties and central units underspending their budgets in the year, and that's about $33.1 million. And a large part of this surplus is due to that late notice of the unanticipated increase in the grant. So it took time for our processes to allow for the expenditures of these funds, starting hiring processes that had been delayed or deferred, kicking in allowing for the application to receive internal research grants and those types of things, as well as getting some capital projects off the ground. Another significant contributing factor to this surplus was the late notice of program expansion funding for a number of our medical programs. And prior to the election, the former government had committed to expanding some medical programs at the university, but we didn't receive a letter saying exactly how much they were going to be funding. When the new government got in place, and that was midway through the fiscal year, they committed that the program expansions were a priority, but again, we're figuring out their financial situation, and took a while for them to let us know how much we were going to be given. And ultimately, we didn't receive the letter until near the end of March, which was just days before the end of our fiscal year. And so the faculty was being quite reasonable and not spending money they didn't know whether they had, but it's hard to spend millions of dollars when you find out at the end of March, by the end of March. And so that contributed to this surplus as well. And those funds are being spent this year and will be spent in future years to support the expansion of those programs. Looking at the next 4 bars, which are mainly centrally budgeted pieces, so the third bar down, the dark blue bar, represents unused contingencies and reserves in the budget. That was $7.3 million. So we budget contingencies to mitigate risk in expenditures or sudden revenue shocks in the year. And in 23-24, $7.3 million of those reserves were not used and contributed to the surplus. The fourth bar down, the light blue bar, shows tuition revenue being about $6 million higher than budgeted in the year, and this was because enrollment was higher than we'd budgeted, primarily due to an unexpected large cohort of international students. The fifth bar down, the brown bar, represents $8.3 million that is related to other revenues and cost savings, and the largest piece of this was greater interest revenue. So interest rates were higher last year than we'd anticipated in the budgeting cycle, and that contributed a little more income on the interest that we make on cash that we have on hand. So where did this surplus go? So as we discussed, the non-operating amounts are committed to future expenses. The $33.1 million saved by faculties and units was retained by those units to invest in future initiatives, and the remaining surplus was split between paying for additional supports provided to students, topping up the university's rainy day fund, and an allocation to support future capital investments and address deferred maintenance on campus. So the last slide showed the components of the annual surplus for the year ended March 31st, 2024. This slide shows the same information for each of the last 5 fiscal years. And you can see that the surplus declined leading into March of 2023, but increased again in 23-24 due to the factors that we'd kind of discussed on the previous slide. So this slide shows more detail on the operating component of that last slide, so that blue piece. And you can see the variability from year to year in the different components of that surplus. And a couple of things that I wanted to point out on this one is you can see the tuition and reserves, which are the brighter blue and darker blue pieces kind of near the middle or lower part of the graphs here. They declined heading into 22-23 and 23-24 from previous years as we got a little more aggressive on our assumptions about what revenues would be from tuition and reduced contingencies in the budget because we weren't using them. And we'll continue to look at those numbers and really try to refine them and get the right number. The goal here is not to bank a bunch of money, it's to get it out there and spend it in support of the university's mission. And you can also see that increase in faculty and unit surplus in 23-24 that was largely related to when we found out about the resources available to us. So the previous slides showed the difference between the revenues and expenses in a given year. This slide shows the accumulated unspent balances of those surplus as at March 31st for each of the past 3 years, with the most recent year at the bottom of the chart. And the first section on the left, the yellow parts, represent the provisions to support university-wide priorities, which were $166.8 million at March 2024. The larger blue component in the middle are the accumulated carryover and provision balances of academic units, and they were about $160 million at March of 24. And I have a bit more detail on each of those components on the next slide. Central units of the university likewise retain any unspent balance of their budgets to spend on one-time initiatives or projects, and they're shown by VP at the right-hand side of the slide. Accumulated carryover and provisions are money that was unspent the previous years and it's been set aside for use in the future. It can only be spent once and then it's gone. So these funds are typically committed to time-limited initiatives or to one-time expenditures. So these graphs show that these balances have been growing over the last few years, and there's a few reasons for this, and an important one has been delays in advancing capital renewal projects due to supply chain issues and construction cost inflation, which has resulted in these funds being spent more slowly than we'd hoped, and that in combination with surpluses identified in the previous slides. So we'd like to see units spending their budget each year to maximize the impact of those funds on our mission. And in order to better incent the timely use of these funds, we've made some revisions to our carryover process, which what Diane will speak to in a bit. This slide provides more detail on the blue portion of that last chart. And shows that faculties have $160 million in accumulated carryover and provision balances, and to date, each faculty retains 100% of that accumulated surplus. The pie chart provides a breakdown of the balances by source or commitment for all of the faculties combined. The breakdown of these funds may look a little different next year as part of the change in policy. We're working to have increased consistency in the way that faculties account for carryover and provisions. It differs a little bit currently by faculty. But with the information we have today, about a quarter of the accumulated funds have been earmarked for capital projects and renovations, many of which are underway. About half has been set aside for specific initiatives through external or internal restrictions, including internal research grants, faculty T&E funds, and financial support for grad students. And the remaining quarter is held really for budget contingency, one-time projects and faculty support as carryover. This chart shows the breakdown of the university-wide carryover and provisions, that $167 million. And most of these funds have been allocated to capital priorities. So safe, reliable, and modern infrastructure and learning spaces are critical to the delivery of teaching and research at the university. It takes resources to build and maintain our facilities. We have over 100 buildings with an average age of over 50 years. We're responsible for the roads, sewers, and power distribution on the 676 acres of Fort Garry campus. We have highly complex and technical facilities and equipment, including barns, dental labs, engineering labs, simulation rooms, and so on, that support world-class teaching and research across all of our disciplines. Our maintenance and renewal backlog is currently estimated at over $600 million and growing annually, with projects to renew aging and failing infrastructure, improve accessibility on campus, and update learning, research, and other spaces. Without significant deferred maintenance funding, progress on our long list of prioritized maintenance projects remains slow, increasing costs and growing the backlog. $30 million annually would be needed to start to reduce our deferred maintenance backlog, and we receive very limited capital and maintenance funding from the province. We don't have the resources to build in sufficient funding for maintenance and capital renewal in the operating budget, so our backlog of deferred maintenance grows each year. We receive very limited capital and maintenance funding from the We've dedicated a large portion of our centrally available surpluses to capital renewal, and our ability to do this will decline as our budget becomes tighter in the next few years, reducing annual surpluses. So some of the projects that are outlined on this chart include $18.1 million for something that's identified as ISIP, and really what that is are energy consumption reduction and GHG reduction or emission reduction projects on campus that are largely funded by the federal government but has a university matching component. These projects are underway, but supply chain issues have resulted in some delays in getting the equipment here. It's been ordered. It should be here in 2026 and installed in 2026. There's $25.3 million that's been set aside for capital projects under $10 million, and this includes projects to address accessibility, HVAC upgrades, addressing deferred maintenance, and funding to start on the renewal of the university's hydro grid, which is a $90 million project to address the Fort Garry hydro grid, which is beyond end of life and is experiencing significant reliability issues, as I think most people have probably seen. $8.3 million has been set aside for the Churchill Marine Observatory, and if you caught this presentation last year, you'll notice that that provision's been reduced by about $10 million as progress on that project has been made. $20 million has been set aside for the renewal of McRae Hall, which is a project that is currently underway. And $23.2 million has been set aside for approved learning spaces and infrastructure renewal projects, which are underway. The blue wedge, or the wedge on the right for university-wide priorities of $35 million, includes $13.5 million for systems renewals, so IT systems like the HR system, the student information system, and other institution-wide IT projects. $7.9 million that relates to expenditure commitments made last year, but which won't be paid until this year. $4.3 million that has been set aside to fund commitments that have been made for future employee benefits, and then another $9 million that has been set aside for a variety of things like future income tax expense, insurance, and a number of other operating projects and priorities. Also included is the $30 million fiscal stabilization or rainy day fund, which can be used to soften the impact of unexpected financial shocks. And while this is only 3.6% of our operating budget, we've seen in recent years that it's important to have adequate reserves in the event of a financial shock or unexpected expenses or loss of revenues. So as a charitable not-for-profit, the university's objective is not to maximize our net income. Rather, we manage our finances to maximize our ability to deliver on our teaching, research, and service mission, while maintaining adequate reserves to ensure our long-term financial sustainability. No single measure on our financial statements can capture the university's overall financial health, but some accountants from the international accounting firm KPMG developed some ratios and a tool to measure the financial health of universities. There's a full discussion of this in the university's annual report, which you can check out on the financial services part of our website. Basically, there's 4 ratios that are listed, and they combine to provide a comprehensive score of a university's financial health, which they call the Composite Financial Index. This score is measured on a scale from -4 to +10, where +3 is defined as the threshold amount for a university demonstrating reasonable financial health. With a composite score of 5.1, it's fair to say that U of M is currently in reasonable financial health. With the increased surplus in 23-24, the score increased over the prior year. Unfortunately, we don't expect large grant increases every year, as nice as that would be. And we anticipate that the federal cap on international student study permits will reduce revenues. So we expect expenditures will increase more quickly than revenues in future years. And that, combined with completing some of our capital projects that are underway, we expect that CFI score will decline, but still remain in a reasonable level over the coming years.
All right, so that's where we were last year. I'm now going to talk about this year's budget. We're about halfway through the 24-25 budget. Planning for the budget started in June of 23, and the budget was approved by the board in May of 24. At that time, the board approved an operating budget of $820 million, and that included a 2% increase on the grant from the provincial government, as well as a 2.75% increase in domestic tuition. The two biggest factors in the budget for this year were salaries and enrollment. I'm going to speak a bit to each of those. As some of you may recall, in January of last year, the federal government announced caps on international student study permits. This has increased a lot of uncertainty around international enrollment levels across Canada. Enrollment last year, or the previous year, was higher than expected, so we adjusted the current year budget to reflect that expectation, but we also offset it by an anticipated 5% decline in overall international student enrollment due to those caps. To mitigate the gap between the University of Manitoba and other institutions on international tuition, we increased international tuition rates by 5.75%. Mike talked about how the province regulates domestic tuition. It does not have jurisdiction or set limits on international tuition. Salaries make up, as Mike said, 75% of our expenditures, and we expect salaries will continue to rise. Wage increases were the largest expenditure increase in the budget in this year. There is some uncertainty in our budget this year on wage increases, as we do have a number of expired collective agreements that we're in the process of renegotiating. So we built into the budget our best estimates of what those increases in costs will be. And I will say that all academic units and central units faced pressure given the increased demands on their resources to address some of the needs for student support in their programs and to support their research. We have been able to make some key investments in the budget this year. This slide just shows you some of the buckets in which we've made investments, and I'll provide you with a little bit of detail about that. So we continue to invest in student services. We added additional resources this year to better serve student admissions and registration processes, and to permanently fund some of the investments that we'd made with one-time money in previous budget years. So for example, we've given permanent funding for an academic integrity specialist. We have increased resources to the registrar's office to help with admissions and registration issues. We've increased funding to support implementation of the requirements under the accessibilities for Manitobans legislation around ensuring that all of our course materials meet accessibility standards and so on. We also are addressing wages and trying to be competitive in our wages by funding negotiated salary increases for all faculties and units. And as Mike said, we've had a number of program expansions reflected in this year's budget. So we've had increases to the undergraduate medical education, to our occupational therapy, physical therapy, nurse practitioner, and physician assistant programs, and those are all reflected in this year's budget. There's also been significant increases to our utility costs, due in part to some of the changes we've made to our HVAC systems to increase airflow in response to COVID, as well as there are increased costs related to the carbon tax and to inflationary pressures on utilities. We also made some increased investment in student financial support. We increased financial support for graduate student fellowships. We also increased support for domestic undergraduate students, and we introduced a new pool of funds to support the financial needs of international students, in recognition that with increased tuition fees for international students, there would be some students who would need some support. We also continue to invest in capital renewal. In particular, we've done some additional accessibility upgrades. We're continuing to do upgrades to our learning and teaching spaces. We've made some improvements to some common spaces across campus and card access to some of our buildings. We've also made investments in research, and in particular this year we've given additional resources to support the team building for interdisciplinary research teams. We've invested in some service improvements, including Microsoft upgrade and software upgrades for purchasing and finance. And finally, we were able to set aside a pool of $3 million, and we invited applications from faculty and staff across the university to put in proposals for projects that would advance the goals that were outlined in our newly approved strategic plan. So that money has been distributed across the university, and projects are underway. Again, projects that align with the priorities that we set out in Momentum. So our academic programming is at the heart of our budget, and we continue to see programs and courses that are being revised to reflect student needs, changes in disciplines, and needs of some of our external partners. In particular, we're continuing to invest in ensuring that there is Indigenous knowledge is infused in all of our programs and in our courses, in alignment with our reconciliation framework and also with the TRC's call to action. And certainly those are important strategic priorities that were identified in the development of our university strategic plan. We're also continuing to look for new and more diverse experiential learning opportunities for our students. We're continuing to deepen and develop new partnerships with the community to ensure that our students have opportunities to develop the knowledge and the skills that they will need to be successful as they either move to further studies or move into the labor market. Now I'm going to shift to talk a little bit about what we're doing is as we develop our plan for the 25-26 budget. We've made some revisions to our budget model, and those changes are going to be implemented for the 25-26 budget year. When we implemented the new budget model in 2018, we committed to doing a review after 5 years. We engaged in consultations in 23-24. Those consultations resulted in a series of recommendations that we are implementing in the 25-26 budget year. The most significant change that we're making is in how we allocate the provincial grant. We are aligning that allocation to more closely align with how the grant is received by the university. So in the past, the grant was allocated based on enrollment and research expenditures, both of which can fluctuate year over year. And you may recall that Mike mentioned that what we receive from the province is a block grant, and it's not tied to enrollment. So what we're going to do moving forward is we are going to allocate the grant as a base grant to each academic unit, and we're going to continue to allocate out tuition based on enrollments. We expect that this will reduce volatility from year to year while still providing resources to address increases in enrollment. The drivers for our central cost allocations have also been simplified, and that's going to make annual budgets of units more stable and make it a little easier to plan multi-year. We've also revised our carryover process and developed protocols in line with those recommendations. We expect that with less variability and more stability year over year in our budgets, that units will be more comfortable spending their budgets, and they will have less need to hold surplus in contingency for future expenses. Carryover results when faculties and units underspend their budgets. These funds provide a contingency that units can use to pay for future expenses, including capital projects, equipment, student supports, and other priorities. But as you saw earlier, our accumulated surplus has been growing. Certainly a reasonable level of surplus is necessary to ensure the financial stability and sustainability of the institution and to deal with unexpected pressures. But too large a surplus means that we're not investing as actively as we can in delivering on our mission. So we would like to see that accumulated surplus decline somewhat over time, and we're making some changes to try to support that change in behavior. Currently, units keep 100% of their surplus. Going forward, our units are going to be allowed to keep up to 10% of their annual budget as carryover, but any funds in excess will be pooled to address strategic priorities across the campus. These priorities and proposals to spend that accumulated and pooled surplus will be evaluated by a university-wide committee, which will make recommendations on the allocation of those funds to myself and the Vice President Administration. Again, the goal of these changes are to ensure that we're using our financial resources to advance our mission in a timely way, while still ensuring a reasonable level of reserve. Mike's going to come now to talk a little bit about some of the other things that we're taking into consideration as we plan for next year's budget.
Okay, thanks, Diane. So enrollment is one of the important things that we look at as we're planning for next year, and certainly the mix between domestic and international students has an impact, a significant impact on our tuition revenue expectations, and is something that we're looking at closely for 25-26. So this graph provides a summary of our actual and projected enrollment trends for 10 years. Changes in the mix of students between international and domestic, as I said, has an impact. In recent years, international students have made up 22 to 23% of our student body, but provided about 44% of our tuition revenue. So recent caps on international student study permits is changing that mix. Demand from international students it has declined this year, and we anticipate that that will continue to decline for the foreseeable future. And at the same time, we're seeing an increase in the number of 18 to 24-year-olds coming out of high school in Manitoba, and we anticipate that that'll result in an increase in overall enrollment at the university. We've seen that actually this year, a fairly sizable increase in first-year domestic enrollment. And so Manitoba students staying in Manitoba for their post-secondary education is good news, but with really low tuition that pays only a small portion of the delivery of our programs, that could create some financial challenges for us. So as we plan for next year, the province has indicated we should be planning for a 1.5% increase in the operating grant and a 3.5% increase in domestic tuition. The province is focused on balancing its budget over the next 3 years, so I think it's safe to say that between that and addressing issues in healthcare, our revenue growth will be limited. We saw a decline in first-year international student enrollment this year, a fairly significant one. And we expect this lower enrollment will continue for the foreseeable future, and as these smaller cohorts work their way through their programs, the related tuition revenues will continue to decline. And we expect that this could add up to about $30 million a year in kind of the 3 to 4 year time frame. We're projecting an increase in domestic enrollment, as I'd mentioned, and we're already seeing that. And from a budget perspective, this may result in us having more students to teach while revenues increases don't keep up with the pace to deliver service, or the cost to deliver services to those students. Collective agreements expired in 2024 and are not yet settled, which means we have some uncertainty over wage costs for next year's budget. And demands for student services across our campus continue to increase as we're seeing greater volumes of transactions for other central supports as well, like libraries, IT, HR, finance, and the research office. Our deferred maintenance backlog continues to grow, and we need to update teaching spaces to support modern pedagogy and update research spaces to facilitate world-class research. So with wage costs increasing and inflationary pressures, we expect that expenditures will grow more quickly than our revenues. Our budget includes a multi-year projections, and the province has provided us with multi-year planning assumptions for grant and domestic tuition increase. And this allows us to be proactive in maximizing the impact of the resources available to us. And we update our assumptions as we get more information and hope to bring a budget to the Board of Governors for their consideration and approval in March of 2025. So this slide gives you a sense of how much more quickly we anticipate expenses to grow than revenues for the next few years. And there's a lot of assumptions included in the analysis, so I wouldn't get too hung up on the details. But in short, we do expect that expense growth will significantly outpace revenue growth for the next few years as revenues are constrained, as we see those declines in international student enrollments, and as we see salaries go up through collective agreement settlements. So I'll now pass it back to Diane to close.
All right, you'll be happy to hear we're at the end of our slides. So in closing, I would just say that as we've tried to articulate, we do have some clear and unexpected financial challenges that we're going to be facing over the next few years. But we are going to continue to use our resources in a fiscally responsible way and do the best that we can to continue to invest in our core mission at the university and make some gains in some of the areas that we've identified as strategic priorities. We're going to implement the revisions to the budget model in support of those goals, and we hope to see some stabilizing of our international student enrollment, which will help us plan as well for the future. So now we would be very happy to answer questions or to hear your comments. We're going to use Menti for questions. So if you want to go to menti.com, or you can use the QR code on the screen and enter the access code, which I hope you can see. Just click on Q&A and type in your question. You can give your name or you can be anonymous, and they're going to come in, and I think you'll read them out for us. Don't be shy. And as well, any of our colleagues online, feel free to submit your questions as well. I see some people typing.
We have our first question. How does out domestic tuition compare to other U15? If low, why not increase?
How did our tuition?
Sorry, how does our domestic tuition compare to other U15?
Yeah, we are at the low end. We are the lowest tuition in Western Canada and lowest among our U15 comparators. And the second part was, why don't we increase? Our domestic tuition rates can only increase the amount that the provincial government allows us to increase those rates. So in part, our rates are so low because for over a decade we had a tuition freeze, and we've only been allowed some very modest increases in tuition over the last number of years. So we dropped to be the lowest, and we continue to remain the lowest. So we can't increase domestic tuition any more than the government allows us to. And as Mike said, what they're letting us know this year is that they're going to allow us to increase domestic tuition by 3.5%, which will ensure that we stay at the lowest. Because, of course, tuition everywhere is increasing.
Thank you. Another question here. As mentioned in the presentation, future years will see less of a surplus retained by the individual units or faculties. For this year, will 100% of surplus be retained?
So we're implementing the changes to the carryover process beginning this year. So at year end, we will be implementing the carryover process. So units will not be retaining 100% of their surplus this year. We'll be starting to implement the carryover process. So we're working right now with units to take a look at what they have in surplus, what are committed, and how much will be brought back centrally for reallocation. But that will happen at the start of the budget year.
Perfect, thank you. Another question here. Will the gap in expenses and revenue result in a decreased programming and/or staffing levels in years to come?
Well, all of our units are going to be challenged to deal with the gap between revenue and expenses. How we adjust our budgets to account for those pressures is probably going to vary by units. Some units will have more flexibility. They have more of their budgets that are allocated to non-salary. But depending on how big that gap is, it certainly could affect how much we're able to invest in salaries moving forward, or how quickly those can grow in terms of new positions. Yeah.
And just on that point, when you saw that that projection, it has some assumptions in it. So if the province increases the grant, that'll change the revenue assumption, in fact, would grow the revenue assumption. So there's some variation in that. If the trend in international students doesn't continue to decrease the way that you saw here, we might have more revenue also. And that's why when Mike presented that, he said the farther you go in the future, there's some assumptions there that's based on. So, we're obviously working to try to convince the province to provide larger grants, and we're working to try to better understand the international market and try to mitigate some of those negative impacts. So we'll have to see that as we go forward, but it certainly has created a bit of uncertainty.
Thank you. Another question. What mechanism will be in place to distribute the surplus if not held by the individual units?
Yeah, so what we will do is we will identify what that pool of resources is, and we will be asking faculties to submit, and central units to submit proposals that will be evaluated by a committee, and that committee will make recommendations to myself and the VP Admin around the allocation of that money. So there will be a consultative process, an application process, and a consultative process that faculties and units will apply to, and we'll look at distributing those funds across the university.
Thank you. How will a 3.75% domestic increase in tuition combat the anticipated $30 million international student shortfall?
So the $30 million shortfall is over a 4-year period?
It'll be an annual thing about 4 years.
4 years into the future, right? So it won't offset that total decrease. There will also be increases in international student tuition fees, which will work forward. So, we don't have a lot of levers to offset that kind of decrease. We can increase tuition fees, and we can get a larger government grant. As you saw in those slides, those are the two primary sources of our revenue. And so this year, as Diane said, we increased international tuition fees by 5.75%. We are trying to moderate the increase in tuition because we understand the cost of living part of it, but we also have to deliver programs and be able to offer the quality that we're doing. And so, again, we'll look at international tuition fees. You've seen that we're way below what other universities are paying. And just to put that in context, if you think of our domestic tuition fees being, say, $1,000 per student less than UBC, you're multiplying $1,000 by 22,000 students or something like that. It's a significant amount. And international, I don't think we're going to go to 11,000 more for international tuition, but I think in this framework, you're going to start to see tuition fees make up some of the other loss in revenue. And we want to do this in a moderate way to support our students and keep university being affordable.
You don't need to scroll through to find the hardest one.
I think this will be our last question here. What recommendations do you have to help units reduce expenditures to offset declining revenues? Are there particular areas that we should be examining in our budget deployment process?
Can you just repeat the first part of the question?
Yeah, for sure. What recommendations do you have to help units reduce their expenditures to offset declining revenues?
Right. I'm going to answer the question a little bit differently. I think the question is, how do we help units plan and utilize their budgets in support of their key priorities. So what we're working with all of our units to sort of help them do better planning, do better projections, to look at vacancy management, like what do they expect in terms of people leaving, how much revenue is that going to free up, how can they invest that in some of the initiatives that are important. So we're trying to more closely plan so that we're using the resources that we have. As Michael said, we'll have to see how the pressure on our budget plays out over the next few years, but we're really trying to help units plan better, utilize the resources that they have, maintain a reasonable reserve, but to put the rest of that money in circulation in support of growing their programs and advancing their research mission. Do you want to talk about finance?
Sorry, and I might just add, some of the changes we're making to the budget model and to the carryover policy or process are intended to support that, to encourage, I guess, more detailed budgeting and ensuring that faculties know at the start of the year exactly what resources are available to them and then committing those to advance their mission in the year. So I do think we'll be supporting the units in helping to figure out how to be more detailed and then how to spend all of their budget in the year. And so that's really what we're working on with these policy changes and some of the other supports we'll be providing.
And if I can add one extra part to that, because the question asked declining revenue. I don't think our revenue is declining. It's going to be growing at a slower pace than it maybe had been, and a lot of that will depend on the international student, which will be likely declining. So it's really about how we adjust to moderate growth in our revenue, where we'll have the faculties we will have to have are those that actually do have very high international student enrollment, and so that flow to them will moderate. But I think some of the things we're doing with the government grant will allow us to kind of balance some of that out. But it's really how we make do with more moderate growth in our revenue.
Perfect. There's a couple more questions flooded in as we were speaking. I'm assuming a lag in the internet connection. One more question here. Does the development of the Southwoods lands provide any revenue to the university in upcoming years?
Yes, but upcoming years. It's like way off in the future, right? So as you've seen with Southwood, there's a lot of work going on there. That's really riverbank stabilization and other work that needs to take place before construction can take place. We're out in market looking for developers. So there's no developers yet. So if you think about that, developer comes forward, it's going to take time to get all the permits, to do all the drawings. So it's likely not in the next 5 years that a lot of revenue is going to be driven. And, it's building over time. And so, if we were building 50 buildings on Southwood at one time, it might drive quite a bit of revenue, but it'll be incremental. It'll be a building or 2, 3 over time. It's a 40 to 50 year project, and so that's not going to be a short-term solution to the revenue challenges we might have over the next 5 to 7 years.
Thank you. Other question. How does the University of Manitoba compare to the other U15 institutions when approaching the tuition rates changing for federal caps on international students?
Tuition rates changing?
Sorry, repeat that?
How does the University of Manitoba compare to other U15 institutions with these upcoming federal caps on?
So, can I just say that the cap didn't turn out to be the problem. So we didn't actually use all the cap. So we were given 7,000 something hundred that was our cap. We didn't actually use that total number of caps, and that was consistent with universities across Canada. From what I've heard, and this is kind of it's not a scientific number, but what I've heard across is that institutions actually had about 30% more spaces than the applications that they issued. And that's because the impact of the government policy was really to create a chill in the international market. And students who maybe had applied who actually had applied, and we would normally issue acceptance letters to, they decided to go elsewhere. Other countries, other places. So it created a real chill in the international market. And so all institutions, or most institutions across Canada, by the way, both in the colleges and universities, what they observed is that the initial applicants who would have applied in December or January didn't take their applications to the final point where they'd say, we'll pay the deposit for next year, and we're interested in coming to your university, but in a sense withdrew their applications. If not formally, they didn't pay the deposits. And so institutions actually didn't use all of the caps that were given to them. And that's the basic, and so now they've lowered them another 10%. Again, our challenge is driving applications and convincing now international students that University of Manitoba, actually not University of Manitoba, that Canada is still a country that wants them to be here, that is going to support them when they're here. There's a lot of confusion because the rules are continually changing. And so that's been a bigger challenge. So we're less worried about the number of letters that we're able to give out, more worried about driving applications to the institution. I hope that answered that.
Thank you. Another question here. Do we earn interest on our surplus funds? And if so, what is that money spent on?
Sure. So those surplus funds are held as part of the university's working capital. And you may recall I mentioned that our interest revenue was part of the contributor to the surplus. Well, we invest it, we earn interest on it, and it goes back into the operating budget to support the operations of the university.
We may have time for one more question, if there is.
Yeah, this will wrap our discussion for today. Our online programs and course offerings, is the University of Manitoba offering online programs and course offerings that can compete with top-tier international institutions that can help increase tuition revenue overall?
Yeah, so decisions about how programs are delivered are made at the faculty level. We certainly have units that offer entire programs online or delivering them virtually. And so we continue to look at where it makes sense and where units are interested in providing those programs. And I think that we're moving forward in a way which ensures that what we are delivering, if it is through distance or online, is high quality, and so that students are getting a comparable experience if they're taking a program online as they would if they were here in person. Okay. All right, that brings us to the end of our town hall. Thank you for your questions and for your interest in being here. If you were too shy to ask a question, or if you've got some feedback for us, we would welcome you to provide that to us. You can go to budget.consultation@umanitoba.ca and provide your question or give us your comments. We'd appreciate that. I want to thank Mike and our president, as well as the entire team that was involved in organizing the town hall today. And I want to thank all of you for coming in person, and for those of you who've joined us online. Hopefully we've been able to answer some of your questions, and as I say, if you've got more, please send them our way. Thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your day.